we have a great list of speakers from MTI, ESG, and Wong Partnership, who will give us a brief introduction on RCEP, trade in services and investment opportunity, IP, and e-commerce. So we will slowly let participants stream in first, and then we'll start shortly. In the meantime, we appreciate your short feedback on a poll. So you will see a poll on your screen. So we'll appreciate your feedback on the poll. Thank you.
Bilang ke adik, aku jangan tali pakai WhatsApp dia.
So I think it's 9:35. We will start the webinar now. So let me welcome Jason Lee from the SBF FTA team to give a short opening remarks.
Thank you, Nicole. Very good afternoon, morning to our members, speakers, and friends. On behalf of the SBF Free Trade Agreement Education and Outreach team, welcome to the first of our two-part webinar on the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP for short. Some would say this agreement has been a long time coming. Nevertheless, we know that most businesses are very excited about the prospect of RCEP, which covers many, if not most, of our largest and most important trading partners. This agreement has the potential to allow businesses to accumulate inputs from a non-ASEAN party, say China, when exporting to another non-ASEAN party, for example, Australia or New Zealand. This would not have been possible before. Furthermore, businesses are also excited about being able to just understand and use one single FTA instead of multiple ASEAN and ASEAN Plus FTAs. However, it may not be as straightforward, as there are staging periods to consider. The rules of origin may or may not be better or easier to meet. And there is also a novel concept, a country of origin, to consider. There's huge potential for greater benefit from RCEP, of course, but they also take effort to understand how best your company can benefit from it. Therefore, today, we are happy to have experts in their respective fields to guide us. They are Ms. Sulaimah, Senior Director at the Ministry of Trade and Industry, and also the RCEP Chief Negotiator for Singapore, responsible for successfully concluding this agreement. Chung Niang, Head of IP, Technology and Data Group at Wong Partnership, Faridah, Deputy Director at Enterprise Singapore, and finally Eric, Senior Assistant Director at MTI, who leads on services issues. So if any point during the presentation you have a question, please feel free to ask them through the Q&A function below. Time permitting, we will have a Q&A section at the end of this webinar, and I will post them on your behalf. Should you prefer to ask your question directly to a certain speaker, please feel free also to indicate that instead that you wish to ask a question by stating your name and company, and I'll call on you to do so. Finally, if you have any queries after the webinar at any point in time, please feel free to write in to us. Our email is fta@sbf.org.sg. Our team of former FTA users in the private sector themselves and some former government officers have been assisting businesses at any stage of their FTA journey, from considering and exploring different FTAs to issues they've encountered after using FTAs. We have run this complimentary service for close to 2 years now, working closely with the various government agencies on a broad range of issues. Last year, we answered 188 queries. So please do write into us. We want to know the issues you face and your experience with the different FTAs. So without further ado, let me hand over the time to Ms. Sulaimah, Senior Director at the Ministry of Trade and Industry. Sue, please.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. First of all, can everyone hear me? Because
yes, Sue, we can hear you.
Yes, you can? Okay. Let me know if you can't, okay? So again, good morning, everyone. First of all, thank you for attending and joining us in this webinar on RCEP, organized jointly by SBF and MTI. During this 2-day session, we have a group of negotiators who had, in the 8 years of negotiations, some of them have joined us since the beginning and some midway. And also we have subject matter experts who will dive into the key chapters of the RCEP agreement and how they can benefit your company. But before we go into the deep dive, please let me give you just and share with you a broad overview of RCEP. And I'd like to touch on, 5 areas. One, I think it's useful for me to give, an overview of the journey of the RCEP negotiations. Its coverage being RCEP is now the largest FTA around. And more importantly, there have been questions on, we have signed the agreement, so what's next? I think we will touch on that. And what does ratification means, and what does, when does the agreement comes into force? I also note, based on the list of attendants this morning, that there are also representatives from the non-RCEP countries, and hence I will touch briefly on also the issue of accession, because we have received interest from the non-members to say, what can I do to join the RCEP? And also, again, based on the list of companies that I've seen, I think some of the companies here today have been using either the ASEAN Plus One Agreement or our bilateral agreement. And again, so they'll be interested to find out what is it that RCEP is offering on top of all this FTAs. And lastly, I'll briefly touch on the benefits of RCEP on Singapore. Again, here, I'll just touch briefly because, my other colleagues and friends will be going into the deep dive, and they will elaborate more. Can I have the next slide? Next slide, please. The journey, slide 2. Unsing, could I have the slide 2? Okay, if not, maybe I'll just proceed. I understand that the slides have been, distributed to the participants, and basically this is the slide where we have the title as RCEP the Journey. Here again, it's I think everybody have read it in the media that RCEP took 8 long years to negotiate, and ASEAN played a very critical role in this whole journey. The negotiations chaired by Indonesia, they are the country coordinator. We have an excellent, thank you very much. We have an excellent chair, Bapak Iman Bagio, and he has been with the group since the launch of RCEP till the very end. And under his leadership and with cooperation of everyone, we managed to seal the deal. What is not on the slide here, and maybe to share with you, is that ASEAN started discussing what to do with the emerging architecture that was happening after ASEAN has concluded all its ASEAN Plus One FTAs. So by 2006, ASEAN has concluded all the 5 ASEAN Plus One FTAs with 6 dialogue partners. So then, when we also saw, for example, China, Japan, and Korea were starting to also talk about their FTAs, the CJK in short. Then we felt, okay, how do we deal with all this FTAs that's coming up? And based on feedback from the companies, they were complaining that because of the FTAs, the bilateral ASEAN Plus One FTAs, they had to do a lot of changes when you want to export a particular product to 2 different markets, because the rules of origin are different. They have different forms that you need to fill up to export. So ASEAN discussed, and we felt, okay, let's try and rationalize and streamline the rules And how best to do that is basically try and form a regional partnership with all the dialogue partners and ASEAN at the center. So RCEP itself is an important geostrategic initiative that will basically aim to further enhance regional integration. So here, the journey, I'll just like to flag a few milestones. One, basically 2012, that was when RCEP was launched by the leaders at the 21st Summit. And there again, the leaders had endorsed the guiding principles. Basically, what's the guiding principle? You know, because it is important. We need to have guiding principles for this massive negotiation of FTA. And again, all the 16 parties agreed that if you want to put resources and time to negotiate the FTA, we must make sure that one, it builds upon the ASEAN Plus One FTA. It must be modern, comprehensive, high quality, and mutually beneficial. Why mutually beneficial? Because of the diversity of the members in RCEP. You know, we have the Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, and we have the middle countries, and then of course we have the developed countries. So again, that's very important. So with the guiding principles, you know, every time during negotiations when we felt that, hey, you know, do we do A or B, or there's this gap, what do we do? We will revert back to the guiding principle and remind ourselves at the end of the day, you know, it must be a win-win for everyone. Right? After the launch, the announcement of the launch, the negotiations did not start until 2013. The first meeting was in May, and it was held in Brunei. We had what do you call? Sorry for that. We had what do you call? Continued our discussion for the next 6 and 7 years. 2019 was an eventful year. Why? 2 reasons. One, we concluded the tax negotiations for all 20 chapters, okay, by the 16 parties, which includes India. So in November, we concluded the tax with only a few outstanding issues, basically the market access bilateral negotiations between some countries and technical issues which can be concluded. You know, we wanted to conclude by another year. So that's what we achieved in 2019. But unfortunately, a day after we concluded the text of the 20 chapters, India announced of its decision to leave RCEP. PM Modi said, you know, they're not ready to continue and join the RCEP nor sign the agreement. So that was a sad day for all of us, for Singapore and, you know, all the partners. And but you know, India had its reasons, and we respect it. After that, so in 2020. What we did was we continued to finalize the market access, the technical issues. We invited India to join the negotiations for that whole year, but they said they were not ready. And, you know, so, yeah, so at the end, when we signed the agreement on the 15th of November, 2020, it was only by the 15 parties because India was still not ready to sign it. So, and so we signed, and I must, you know, again, make this point that the signing of RCEP in 2020 you know, it's a major milestone. Again, it is a challenging but worthy journey for all the parties, right? It was a hard and challenging task, but, you know, we reached the end goal. So that was good. It was also a strong testament of the region's determination and commitment to deepen economic integration at difficult times. You know, we all know that all the members in the whole world face a COVID-19 pandemic. But despite that, we had our meetings every month and sometimes twice a month because we had to do it virtually. And that was another challenge because, you know, we've never done a negotiation of an FTA, of this massive FTA virtually. It is very difficult because, you know, when a virtual negotiation is something, you know, you can't, you know, read the other partner. You know, when it's physical, you know, if in the, you find something which is okay, it's not something that you think you can agree upon, or you're not clear, you can always go across the table or at tea breaks or dinner, you know, and settle the issue. So that was also one of the greatest challenge that we have. last year before we concluded the agreement. But finally, we signed. And although India did not sign the RCEP, we hope they will join later. So, I mean, if you would ask me why it took such a long time to negotiate RCEP, basically it's because a few reasons. One, there's this huge gap between the level of development among the parties, and there's also tension between members on the political front. Elaborate on that, you know, you know what it is. And most important thing, there was also an absence of the bilateral FTAs between partners. What it means is that, you know, for example, Japan, China, and Korea, and Australia, this was the first time that they're coming together for an FTA. So, you know, it took a longer time for them to see what is it that they would be able to bring to this table. And that, you know, and we have, each of us have our sensitivity. So that actually brought some complications to the negotiations. But again, throughout the 8 years, you know, every time we faced a problem, all parties wanted to reach that target of having this FTA of 16 parties, you know, and sign, and so that basically we can improve the businesses, the trade flows, and everything in the region. Yeah. Right. Next slide, please. Yeah. So basically, this gives you a snapshot, right? RCEP is now, like I say, the largest FTA in the world, covering 30% of global trade, of GDP, and also 30% of the world's population. You know, and you know, it had been, the numbers would be better if India was in. Well, we're still hoping that they were in. So the RCEP to date, it covers 20 chapters. And here, you know, just are some of the key ones, what we have. And, you know, in addition to the traditional chapters like goods, services, and investment, we also have included intellectual property, competition policy, e-commerce, and government procurements. And we have a special, again, chapter on SMEs. And just to touch on intellectual property, for example, we do have the issue touched in some of the FTAs, like ASEAN Australia New Zealand FTA, for example. But in the ASEAN Plus One, most, you know, the commitments were rather more for cooperation. Whereas in RCEP, you know, later will be, perhaps the experts will elaborate, there are some hard commitments. For example, that we talked about, you know, enforcement in IP, and then exchange of information, and e-commerce too. And, you know, there were some, my colleagues will elaborate on that. So after the signing, there are high hopes that RCEP, you know, will bring more regional trade and investment and open up new opportunities for businesses and the people and consumers. And we hope that, you know, this will help us move ahead and support the recovery from the economic impact of COVID-19. And just to share, based on the preliminary assessment by the ASEAN Secretariat, the agreement could add US 186 billion to the global economy, as well as 0.2% to the GDP of its members, benefiting from the RCEP. Therefore, here I'd like to make a pitch, and I hope that, you know, all the companies will take some time to review the agreement, and hope that your companies will be able to use it. I know that, you know, the media have said that the agreement is like 14,000 over pages, right? The text itself is about 400 plus, but the balance is basically, these are the hard offers and commitments made by the 15 countries. And they are very detailed. For example, in the trade in goods annexes, you will have, like, you know, for each of the 15 countries, what are they offering to one another in terms of the reduction, the elimination and reduction of the tariff rates. So, you know, it would be useful, would encourage for companies who are now exporting, for example, you're exporting to China, or Korea, or Japan, look at it and see, you know, what's there for you. Next. Yeah, I think this is I've received questions about what now, especially from companies. I want to use this agreement. So what do you do? So the next important step for all the 15 RPCs is to clear the domestic processes as soon as possible so they can ratify the agreement. And under the RCEP agreement, all the 15 countries, they are supposed to issue an instrument of ratification to the ASEAN Secretariat. Then it will be considered as officially ratified. Singapore and China are the only two RPCs to date who have actually issued our instrument of ratification to the ASEAN Secretariat. The question that I've received also is, now that Singapore and China have ratified the agreement, can Singapore and China benefit and enjoy preferential treatment? The answer is no, because under the agreement itself, you would need 6 out of the 10 ASEAN member states, 3 out of the 5 ASEAN FTAs to officially ratify the agreement. And then 60 days after that, you will then, the agreement will come into force. And here, the good news is, we at the officials level, we have agreed to try and issue the instrument of ratification by latest 31st October of this year. And once that's done, we will be able to implement the RCEP by 1st January next year. Just to share, we know that several countries will be able to do that. At the moment, some of them, really in, or if they're almost there. Some of them would need to do the translation and all that. I think that hurdle has been cleared. And then I think it's just more of the political process that they have to go. Some are 2 steps, some are 3 steps. So, but at the end of the day, I think all the 15 countries are taking steps to do that, to ratify by middle or 3rd quarter of this year, and then we can implement the RCEP next year. So again, here I'd like to again appeal to to companies. We do have another 6 months because it's now in June, and hopefully prepare ourselves to take advantage of this agreement when it enters into force next year. And here, just to share with you that for MTI, we're working with a company to come up with simple booklets, right, to touch as a guide for businesses on how to use RCEP. It will cover trade in goods, because that's one of the key area where we have received a lot of responses and queries on whether my company will be able to benefit RCEP for my products and my exports and all that. So we're going to do that. And then we also have the booklet covering services, investment, e-commerce, and also on IP. So once it's ready, we will share with you. It will be on the website. Yeah. The next topic, like I mentioned today, because there are participants in the audience who may be interested in the issue of can another non-party now join RCEP? The answer is yes, right? We have been approached by several, and from the start, ASEAN and the ASEAN partners have decided that we want to have an inclusive agreement, and therefore, after it enters into force, we will be happy to welcome, new and interested parties to join the agreement. Under the RCEP, it will be new members will be able to join RCEP 18 months after the entry into force. But here, just to also highlight that, the terms and conditions for a session has not been, discussed yet. And because at the moment we are, focusing on the countries are focusing on the ratification domestic processes, and the details of the terms and conditions and processes of a session. This will be discussed by the joint committee, which will be established upon the entry into force of this agreement. And another point to flag here is that what about India? India holds a special status in RCEP, and the door is still open for them to join RCEP whenever they like. So like, next week, if India says, hey, I want to join RCEP, I want to join back, they're able to do that. Why? Because they have been a founding member of RCEP. They joined us from the very beginning, when this was launched, and all the way until we finalized the 20 chapters. So they have, they play a part in the negotiation, and therefore they have that special status. All right. The next slide, please. Okay, this is the, I have prepared this because there have been questions on, how does RCEP improve on the ASEAN Plus One Agreements? Again, yes, they are basically 4 areas that made improvements. One is there's a comprehensive trade facilitation measures. Just briefly here, I'll touch on 2 things. One is on the flexible rule of origin. And what's important, there's only a single rule of origin criteria across all the 15 RPCs. So one product, you have a product you're exporting, you want to export to any of the other 14 markets, there's only one rule of origin. In the past, when under the ASEAN Plus One, if your product wants to go to Japan, you have to see what's the rule of origin in the ASEAN Japan. If you want to go then export to China, Korea, they have different rules under the different FTAs. Now, under the RCEP, you will basically have just one single rule for one product for the 15 markets. So that's very easy. Another important thing I'd like to flag here is the accumulation, right? Here under RCEP, what you can do is you can actually source, when you're making a product, you can actually source all your components, your inputs from any of the 15 RCEP countries. And then, that become an RCEP originating product. And you can export it and enjoy the preferential tariff. This was, different. It was not available in the ASEAN Plus One, because in the ASEAN Plus One is basically the ASEAN 10 plus that partner. Whereas now you have ASEAN 10 and all the other 5 partners. You can import your products from any, your components or everything, your raw materials from any of the countries, and then export it out. And of course, there's improved market access for services. A significant number of sectors are open to foreign participation. We actually, it was good that, during the negotiations, we all agreed that each country should offer at least 100 subsectors of services, for liberalization. I think the details again will be in the agreement and the annexes. And similarly for investment rules and disciplines, again, there are various, some improvements in how you can actually invest in another country without additional rules. And of course, the last one is, mentioned earlier, RCEP covers new chapters, which was starting the ASEAN Plus One FTA. And again, the benefits, my colleagues will definitely on later. So these are the key areas of benefits. But I think it's important that I also I make this point, that it is not possible to have improvements on all the areas across the board, or in all chapters. For example, in the area of trading goods, just to quote, while the rules of origin have improved, we have now just a common customs form for you to export. So that's the pluses. But in terms of the coverage, depending on which market, we have actually improved market access for Singapore. So our products, our exports to say China, Japan, and Korea, we have, there will be new products that we have actually secured improvements in terms of the tariff preferential offers. What you might see is that because of the sensitivities between the 15 countries, some of the products, would be able to enjoy better preferential tariffs, say under the ASEAN Internal Goods Agreement, the ATIGA. For example, some ASEAN countries and the partner felt that, hey, this product is very sensitive. Just to use, for example, the petroleum. So the ASEAN country was said, okay, well, I can give that concession to my ASEAN brothers and sisters. I may not want to give to one of the AFPs. So again, that's something you will need to go through the details and see what are the products that actually have that improvement over the ASEAN Plus One or the ATIGA. The good news is that even when RCEP enters into force on 1st, well, hopefully, crossing fingers, in January next year, both the ASEAN internal agreements, the ATIGA, for example, and the ASEAN Plus One FTAs, they will still be in existence. So now the task, the challenge would be for each company is you need to review the RCEP and see where in RCEP there are opportunities for your company to take advantage of. So that requires, work from both the companies and, MTI, our agencies. We are very happy to work together and help and see where you need help, and then, we can do so. And the other area is, the question that have been asked is there protection in investment? Referring to the investor state dispute settlement mechanism, or ISDS in short. Unfortunately, again, when we were negotiating the RCEP, this was something over the years there have been negotiations, debates, arguments, whether it's good or bad. So, the 16 countries then couldn't agree and reach a common decision, a united position on it. So what do we do? Like in most areas where we have difficulties, what do? We decided to park this in what we call a billion agenda. Because for some of us who said, hey, we do want ISDS because we are investing overseas and we need to protect our companies. And therefore the agreement is basically fine. After 2 years of entry into force, all of us will go and discuss this issue again and see where we go from there. So that's just to give you the overview on how it is the improvements that we have or lack of based on the ASEAN Plus One. Okay, so how does it affect Singapore? The next slide, please. Yeah, I'm confident that the RCEP will provide a boost to trade and businesses between Singapore and the RCEP countries and beyond the region. Companies can expand its operation in the region through Singapore by leveraging a network of the FTAs, including the RCEP. It will bolster employment opportunities for businesses and people. And again, companies can explore what are the newer, more creative things that you can do under the RCEP. So perhaps I'll just want to cite a few examples here. On tariff elimination, like I said earlier, we couldn't get 100% coverage. We started the negotiation by wanting to have 100% coverage, just like, we had it under our ASEAN, Australia, New Zealand FTA. But the other partner says, hey, look, there are sensitivities and, we can't go for 100% coverage. So we had to adopt a pragmatic position, and we said, okay, let's see what's the median. And at the end of it, we all agreed to say, okay, it has to be more than 90%. So we thought the median would be 92%. And here I'd like to say that, we were so happy during the negotiation because India actually improved its offer to ASEAN under RCEP to 90% coverage compared to 74% in the ASEAN India FTA. So if India was in RCEP, we would have that additional market tariff preferential access. But it's okay. We still have improvements for Singapore, at least. We have improvements for our exports to China, Japan, and Korea. And again, like I say, I'd encourage companies to check what these products are. In terms of non-tariff measures, again, that has been a key issue that we were discussing. Under RCEP, what is good is we agreed to provide a mechanism for technical consultation, and stronger binding commitments to improve the transparency of the import regulations. So that's just name a few. Again, for rules of origin, because of accumulation rule, I do hope that the companies, in Singapore will be able to source from the other markets, accumulate and produce in Singapore for your exports. And hopefully that will actually help the companies in increasing your exports to all the other markets in the region. And I'm told that actually the rules of origin in RCEP, for some products, when you compare that to ASEAN Japan, is much better. For example, now under RCEP, we have co-equal rule for biscuits, cakes, and pastries, leather handbags, and packaged black tea, compared to the rules under the ASEAN Japan. And in terms of customs, the simplified customs procedures, enhanced trade facilitation provisions are really a value add in RCEP compared to the ASEAN Plus One. For once, there will be expeditious clearance of goods, including the release of express consignment and perishable goods within 6 hours of arrival. So that's something that, would be good, especially in the current situation. There will also be just a single common RCEP form for exporters to use to all the 15 export countries. And this will again facilitate trade and reduce reduce cost of doing business. And again, there will be, the services. Here we have agreed to adopt what we call a negative list approach on the services. Basically, whatever is most of the services sectors are open, right? And then there will be, if it's not listed, then it will be there will be some exceptions have been taken, and it will be easier for the companies to read the agreement based on the negative risk approach. Again, yes, investment commitments include the provision of the performance requirements for investors as a condition for entering, expanding, and operating in other RCEP countries. So these are just some of the few benefits that I'm sharing, and hopefully my colleagues, when they delve into the greater chapters, will be able to elaborate further. All right, and perhaps at this point in time, thank you, I finished the key things, but I'd just like to make a pitch here that we will be, we are planning for a few more activities, but what we want to do is we would like to move away from the general RCEP webinar like this today and tomorrow, and we are hoping to actually have a more focused session with on a sectoral basis. So, for example, if you are, whether a food manufacturers association, your PE and whatever textiles, we're very happy if there's interest to actually meet with all these sectoral industry groups and have a chat and a discussion on how we can take advantage of the RCEP. Happy to do that, together with SPF, MTI with SPF, our agencies, customs, and of course, the other experts. So we can do that, and we're planning to do so. And my last point is, by signing the RCEP, what we've done is we've built a road, right? And the companies are like the cars on the road. So we do hope that through this session and future focus sessions, and through our own, through your review of the RCEP text and agreement, you'll be equipped to take advantage of the agreement, and you'll be one of the many cars on the RCEP road. And on that, I thank you. Happy to take questions later. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue. So now, next we will have Mr. Eric from MTI, who will talk about trade and services. Eric, please.
Thanks, Nicole, for the introduction. Hi, everyone. My name is Eric, and I'm from the Ministry of Trade and Industry, ASEAN Division. I was part of the team that negotiated the Trade and Services chapter in the RCEP, so I'm very happy to be here today to talk to you about the benefits that Singapore has secured in the RCEP Trade and Services chapter. I think in general, when it comes to FTAs, most people are generally more aware of the benefits derived for the export and import of goods, because when there is a reduction in tariffs, that's an immediate cost saving that you can see immediately. But for the Trade and Services chapter in an FTA, the benefits are often less tangible, and so people do not often perceive these benefits immediately. I hope that after today's webinar, though, you get a better idea of the benefits that the Trade and Services chapter also brings to businesses. So there are 4 key benefits in the Trade and Services chapter in general. This is by no means all of the benefits of the Trade and Services chapter, but I thought I would just narrow down on the 4 key benefits that would impact businesses the most. And number 1, and perhaps the most important benefit, is that of market access. Now, what do we mean when we speak of market access? Market access is basically the right of a business in Singapore to expand overseas to an RCEP participating country and to provide services to the consumers there. So what this translates to in terms of implementation is that the RCEP participating country cannot have any laws or regulations which prevent a service supplier from another RCEP participating country from supplying a committed service to its people. So this includes the 5 restrictions you see on your screen. RCEP parties commit to not have any of these restrictions on the services sectors that they have committed to in the RCEP. So, for example, they cannot have any limitation on the number of service suppliers in the service sector. They cannot impose the quota on the total value of service transactions in that service sector. They cannot have limitations on the total quantity of service output. They also cannot have a set number of people that may be employed in a particular sector. They also cannot have any legal requirements or measures which restrict or require specific types of legal entity or joint venture through which a service supplier may supply a service. So with this increase in market access, businesses from Singapore, for example, can now expand to the RCEP participating countries in the services sectors that they have committed to liberalize. Now, for the second key benefit of the RCEP Trade and Services chapter is that of national treatment. National treatment is basically a commitment from an RCEP participating country that it will not discriminate between local and foreign service suppliers. So, for example, if Singtel, say, decides to expand into Japan and provide telecommunication services to the people there, the Japanese government cannot give preferential treatment to the local telecoms company over Singtel. And Japan must give service suppliers from all other RCEP participating countries treatment that is no less favorable than that accords with its own suppliers. Of course, this is only an example. And of course, this is subject to Japan having committed to this service sector in its schedule of commitment, which I'll be talking more about later on. Now, the third key obligation for the RCEP Trade and Services chapter is the idea of most favored nation treatment, or what we call the MFN treatment. This is quite similar to the idea of national treatment in that the RPC, the RCEP participating country, commits not to discriminate between service suppliers, but this time it is a commitment to not discriminate between a service supplier from one country and that of another country. So to use the example of Japan again, if Japan has made a commitment for MFN in banking services, it cannot give preferential treatment to banks from the US as opposed to banks from an RCEP participating country. It must give the services suppliers from RCEP participating countries the same treatment that it gives to service suppliers from other countries to which it has also established FTAs with. So this is what we call giving the most favored nation treatment, or what we also call give to one, you must give to all. Next, and the fourth key obligation under the RCEP Trade and Services chapter is that of local presence. The local presence obligation is basically the obligation that an RCEP participating country shall not require a service supplier of another party to establish or maintain a representative office, a branch, or any form of juridical person, or to be the resident in its territory in order to supply a service to its people. So this means that if, for example, I'm a web designer in Singapore and I wish to supply my web designing services to somebody in Japan again, Japan cannot have the requirement that I must set up a shop or set up a branch office in its country before I can provide these web designing services to the consumers in Japan. And the web designer can simply provide the services over the internet directly to the people in Japan. So this is this will give further greater market access to services suppliers in Singapore to expand to the RCEP participating countries. Now, previously I mentioned that a country must first commit to a service sector before it is open to market access. Now I'll elaborate a little bit more about what I mean by the schedule of commitment. So the way FTAs are structured, RCEP included, is that countries will provide a list of services sectors that it has agreed that it will comply with the 4 key obligations that I just mentioned. So it's not the case that a country will automatically open up all of its services sectors just because it signed the FTA. You have to look at the schedule of commitment of the RCEP participating country to determine what are the areas that are now opened and which you as a business can now provide services to, assuming that it was not open already previously. So in general, there are 2 ways in which a RCEP participating country can schedule their commitment. There is the positive and the negative list format, which you see on your screen now. I'll start with the positive list format because it's a little bit more straightforward. So under the positive list format, the country lists down all of the sectors that it agrees to be bound by the 4 legal obligations, which I mentioned earlier. So it will only commit to those services sectors that it has put down in its positive list. Whereas in the negative list, the country essentially commits to the entire universe of services sectors, but they will list down certain specific exemptions that they would like to be exempted from the 4 obligations that I mentioned earlier. So the negative list format is generally seen as a more liberal way of scheduling one's commitment because from the get-go, the starting point that countries start from is that they will liberalize all of their services sectors with the exceptions of only certain services sectors which they have carved out in their negative list. Now, to have an overview of what are the different formats that the countries have committed in RCEP, I have prepared this slide. So as you can see from the slide, among the external partners of ASEAN, 3 have scheduled their commitments in the negative list format. That will be Australia, Japan, and South Korea. And in the positive list format, you have China and New Zealand who have done so in that way. Within ASEAN, only Singapore, Malaysia, and Indonesia has formatted in the negative list format, whereas the rest of ASEAN has scheduled in a positive list format. Now, you may ask, why would countries voluntarily commit to scheduling their commitments in the negative list format when there are other countries that are doing it in a positive list format, which is generally less ambitious, right? But the reason for this is because when we are negotiating the Trade in Services chapter, we also take into consideration the domestic conditions in the other countries. So, for example, we try to take into consideration the level of development of the countries and how prepared they are to open up their services sectors. And by doing so, we try to give a little bit of leeway for countries that require a little bit more time to prepare their commitments in the negative list format. So it is not that they will stick to the positive list format forever, but instead, the countries that have now scheduled their commitments in the positive list format for now has 6 years to move on from the positive list format of scheduling of commitments to the negative list format. Of course, exceptions is given to the less developed ASEAN member states, which includes Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar. In their case, we have given them a concessionary period of 15 years to transition from the positive list format to the negative list format. taking into account their status and level of development, and maybe they need a little bit more time to prepare their domestic industries before they allow the access of foreign service suppliers. Now, I'll talk briefly about how a business like yourself can read the schedule of commitment in the RCEP Trade and Services Chapter, so that in the future, if you're thinking of expanding to a particular country, you can find out for yourself whether that particular sector is open for you to access. So I'll start with the positive list format first. So what you see on the screen now is an example of what a positive list schedule of commitment will look like. So I've taken the example of China in this case. So you'll see that there is 4 columns in a positive list schedule. And the first column lists down the sector that the country has committed to either market access or national treatment in the RCEP Trade and Services Chapter. And in the second adjacent column, you see the limitations that the country has imposed, even though they have committed that additional sector to market access and national treatment. So it's kind of like they have committed to this service sector, but they have also provided some exceptions and some exemptions within the services sector that they would like to preserve, even as most of that service sector is now open to foreign service suppliers. So on the second and third column, you can see the header is limitations on market access and limitations on national treatment. You see that the exceptions are listed, are numbered 1, 2, 3, and 4, 1, 2, 3, and 4. What this 1, 2, 3, and 4 refers to is the modes of supplying a service. So within the FTA negotiating committee, we try to classify the ways that a service supplier can supply a service to consumers in 4 general modes. So in mode 1 is where a service supplier provides a service to a consumer in another country without itself moving to that country. So it supplies this service through either the internet or the telephone or the fax. So there's no movement of either the consumer or the supplier in mode 1. In mode 2 is when the consumer moves to the country of the service supplier to enjoy the service that is being supplied by the service supplier. So this is what we call mode 2 of supply of service. Mode 3 is the converse of mode 2, in which the service supplier will move to the country where the consumer is at and set up shop there to provide service directly to the consumers there. So for example, if DBS Bank decides to open a branch office in Korea to provide banking services to the Korean people, that would be a mode 3 supply of service because it has moved to that country to set up shop and provide service to the people there. And mode 4 is when the service supplier, the natural person itself, the individual, not the company, not the DBS Bank, but an employee maybe of DBS Bank, that moves to that country where the consumer is at to take up employment with a company in that country to provide a service to a consumer there. So this is what we call the mode 4 supply of service by an individual and not a company. So going back to the schedule of commitment, you will see that they have listed the exceptions that they would like to have for each of the modes of providing a service. So on your screen, you may see that, for example, for market research services, China has put unbound for mode 1 and mode 2 in terms of market access. What unbound means is basically that China will not be bound by the obligations of market access for the mode 1 and mode 2 supply of services. But it has opened up mode 3 with certain exceptions. So in this case, it has put down the exception of only partly foreign invested enterprises with foreign majority ownership are permitted and economic needs tests are required. So this is the exception that it has placed down for mode 3, but otherwise the mode 3 supply of services for market research is opened. Now you may also see that down below under management consulting services, China has put down none for mode 1 and mode 2. What none basically means is that there are no exceptions that it would like to undertake under mode 1 and mode 2, and hence mode 1 and mode 2 in this case is fully opened, and China is fully committed to the obligation of market access for the mode 1 and mode 2 supply of services for management consulting services. Okay, now I move on to the negative list format for the schedule of commitment. So what you see on the screen is an example of what a negative list would look like. In this case, I've taken the example of Japan's schedule of commitment in the RCEP Trade and Services chapter. By the way, I call it schedule of commitment so that I don't confuse the participants here, but actually the right terminology for a negative list schedule is schedule of non-conforming measures. I thought I'll stick to the term of schedule of commitment to reduce confusion for participants that may not be familiar with the technical term. So the way that a negative list format schedule is usually structured is that there will be two annexes in a negative list format schedule. There will be Annex A and Annex B. And in Annex A is where the RCEP participating country will list down the existing measures that it has, the laws and regulations in its country, that is not fully compliant with the legal obligations in the RCEP Trade and Services chapter, whether it is market access, national treatment, or local presence. And in Annex B of the negative list format schedule is where the RCEP participating country will list down the sector that it would like to be exempted from the obligations that I mentioned earlier. So this is to take into consideration sensitivities that a country may have in a particular sector. This is normal in FTA negotiation treaty practice because all countries, Singapore included, have sensitivities in some sectors. So for example, in Singapore, we may have sensitivities in the legal sector where we will require foreign service suppliers in the legal field to have certain qualifications or certain licenses before it can provide a service to Singaporeans here in Singapore. So it is normal to have all these exemptions for services sectors in Annex B, and that's the way that the negative list is generally formatted. So what you see on the screen now is essentially Annex A of a negative list format schedule. So you see here that it starts with the sector, then the subsector, and then the industry classification of the sector that Japan, in this case, would like to exempt from the obligations of the Trade and Services chapter. And under the role for type of obligation, it states down the obligation that it would like to be exempted from this sector. So in this case, you can see that Japan has indicated that it would like to be exempted for market access and local presence for the service sector of automobile maintenance services. And in the description row, you can see that it lists down what is the exemption that it would like to seek out of these two obligations that are in the Trade and Services chapter. And you can also see the measures, which is the law and regulation, where you can find this so-called non-conforming measure from the Trade and Services chapter for the purposes of transparency. Now, to move on to Annex B, so this is what an Annex B negative list will look like. You'll see that they have carved out the entire subsector of air transport from the four obligations of national treatment, market access, prohibition of performance requirements, senior management and board of directors. The last two obligations are investment obligations, which my colleague Faridah will talk more about later. But generally, for the top two services obligations, which I mentioned earlier, they have sought to cover out these obligations for the service sector of air transport entirely. I think this is quite normal because I think most countries have sensitivities in the area of air transport. So this is just an example of what an Annex B negative list format schedule of commitment will look like. Now, moving on to the benefits that the RCEP Trade and Services chapter has brought over the existing FTAs that Singapore have with the RCEP participating countries. I have briefly listed down the services sectors where countries have provided greater market access or national treatment commitments over the existing FTAs, whether it's in ASEAN or whether which Singapore has bilaterally with these countries, so that businesses in this webinar can have an idea of where they can expand to next if they are so interested. So some examples are, for example, professional services, business services, research and development, And at the bottom, you can see the countries that have provided further market access commitments to these sectors. So as you can see in this slide, for example, China has provided quite a substantial amount of liberalization in the RCEP, which is something that businesses can take into account when you're thinking of your business expansion plans. Next, another area which has been liberalized as a result of the RCEP is computer and related services, education services, and real estate services. Oh, sorry. Yeah. And over here, you can see that there is a combination of both external partners and ASEAN member states that have provided greater liberalization in the RCEP, and you can look into these sectors for your own business expansion plans. And lastly, you have also distribution services, audiovisual services, as well as tourism services, to which a number of countries have provided greater market access commitments to in the RCEP. I understand that this slide will be circulated to participants after this webinar, so please feel free to look into these sectors if you like, and see if this will affect your business expansion plans. Yeah, and this brings me to the end of my webinar. Thank you very much for your attention, and I think I'll now hand off my time to the moderator. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. So next, as what Eric said, we have Faridah, who will give us a short overview on RCEP, on the investment opportunities. Faridah, please.
Thanks so much. Just give me 2 minutes and I will share screen. Oops. Share. Can I just do a quick check if everyone can see my screen? Okay, perfect. Hi, good morning, everyone. Thanks so much to SDF for having me. My name is Faridah Bte Mohd Saad. I'm actually currently the Deputy Director for Agri-Tech at Enterprise Singapore. So you must actually be wondering why I'm presenting on the investment chapter of RCEP. Well, in my not-so-past life, I was quite privileged to be part of the negotiations team at MCI ASEAN, together with Eric and Sue and the rest of the speakers that you'll hear from the next 2 days. Specifically, I was lead negotiator for the investments chapter during my stint there. So I'm fairly intimate with these provisions, and it's really my pleasure to be here today to take you through some of them and share what they mean for your investments abroad. Also worth mentioning that Eric did such a wonderful job sharing about the provisions in the services chapter. You will notice that some of these will actually reappear in the investment chapter, in particular the reservable obligations, and there's also some overlaps in the scheduling mechanism as well. Okay, so firstly, I think, why is there even an investment chapter in FTAs? It offers Singapore-based investors preferential treatment, a predictable operating environment, and where relevant, an avenue for recourse in the event that the country that you're investing in has actually contravened the obligations that it has previously committed to. Some of you might be familiar with bilateral investment treaties, BITs. Singapore has quite a few of those, for example, with Indonesia and with Myanmar. These are standalone, but you will see that these BITs actually address similar issues as an investment chapter in an FTA. A key difference is, of course, investment chapters in FTAs have an element of market access, which you've seen and you will see for the investment chapter, or what we term as investment liberalization, whereas the focus of the BITs tends to be more towards facilitation and protection of investments. So this is the structure of the investment chapter 10. It comprises of 18 articles, as we like to call it, or subchapters or provisions. I mean, different people like to refer to it differently. They are of varying length. The shortest can be just one paragraph, and then some could be about 4 to 10. I'll just go through some of these in the subsequent slides. So when you open the investment chapter, first and foremost, you'll see a definitions article. So think of it as a glossary, right? Some books, the glossaries are at the back. This one is right in front. because how you've defined, how the countries that are members to RCEP have defined terms like investment, and more importantly, covered investment, the phrase investor of a party, natural person of a party, all of these terms will actually determine whether in the first place your investment can enjoy the benefits and protection of this FTA. So some of the key definitions to take note. Firstly, of course, what is the definition of investment? Some of us think it's fairly intuitive. So just to clarify, it's an open-ended definition of investment that we've adopted here. Although, of course, some illustrative examples have been given. So in the text, you'll see mentions of shares, stocks, loans, rights under contracts, claims to money, movable and immovable property, including leases, mortgages, pledges, etc. The definition of covered investment is, in my opinion, just as important, if not more important. This is where, when you get a hold of the text, you do have to read the footnotes, which are attributed to specific countries. A lot of our ASEAN neighbors do put caveats on what they consider covered investments, and specifically they tend to want to make sure that these have been given approved written agreement by either their board of investment or an equivalent authority in their country. So next is the scope. Again, as the name suggests, following from the definition, scope is really about what does it cover, what does it not cover. So as long as you meet the definition of investor of another party, as well as I mentioned, covered investments, then this FTA then applies to you. Areas in which it does not apply is also spelled out clearly, in relation to things like government procurement, subsidies, and grants. I wanted to also just highlight here, since we've also heard from the services chapter just prior to this, that the investment chapter uniquely applies to mode 3 for services, which is what Eric has gone through, which is termed as commercial presence. So national treatment is the same concept as what Eric has gone through in services chapter, just applied to investments. So I won't go through that too in depth. Similarly, most favored nation treatment, MFN, same concept as in services. Just to note that the MFN treatment for investment chapter does not apply to our CLMV neighbors. Again, as Eric had mentioned, we recognize the different developing status of our neighbors and our partners, and therefore we accord those accordingly. So this article on treatment of investment, you can think of it as summing up two concepts, which is the concept of, number one, that the country in which you're investing in agrees that they will not deny justice to you in any legal or administrative proceedings. And number two is that they will take measures that they deem reasonably necessary to ensure that your investment is physically protected and secure. Now, so you might be wondering, well, that seems a bit vague. What's the benchmark, right? Because different countries may have different interpretations of what fair and equitable treatment mean, and what does full protection and security might mean. And really, that's where the article makes a bit more clear that the country that you are investing in should benchmark that treatment to what we call customary international law. In the actual RCEP investment chapter text, there is an annex which makes mention of this CIL. In layman's terms, it's really just law in which there is a general and consistent practice across states from a sense of legal obligation. Next is an article called Prohibition of Performance Requirements, or PPR. This is actually my favorite article if negotiators are allowed to have favorites, I think. And the reason is because it is by far the most ambitious PPR article that ASEAN countries have undertaken in terms of the obligations that they are committing to. It actually goes far beyond what they have agreed to at the WTO level and even among ASEAN countries before RCEP. As the name suggests, the article basically prohibits countries from attaching preconditions to your investments in their country. So what kind of pre-conditions? So these are listed out. So in terms of ensuring that there's a certain amount of export quota or domestic content requirements, etc. I highlighted F and G in blue because these are, I think, especially important for Singapore-based investors, in which that the countries actually do not force you to force any type of technology transfer as you make those investments, with the exception of our CLM countries. And for G, it's really about forcing you to give a rate or amount of royalty to the country that you're investing in. And these two provisions in particular are actually more than what we have committed to, even among ASEAN countries up until this point, or up until when RCEP actually gets ratified. So this is, I think, one key win and one key gain for all RCEP members. Move on to an article called Senior Management and Board of Directors, or SMBD for short. Basically, this article prohibits the countries that you're investing in from imposing requirements on the nationality of your senior management of your foreign companies or your investments. This is again cross-applied to the Trade and Services chapter as well. But just note that the country may impose nationality requirements for your board of directors, again, provided that the requirement does not materially impair your ability as the investor to actually exercise control over your investment or over your company. Market access. So again, Eric has done a great job in explaining the concept of market access, and he's right to point out that slight difference in terminology that we use for the investment chapter, although it really does mean roughly about the same things. So we use non-conforming measures in the investment chapter. So I just put scheduling or commitments as a way for you to make reference to it. For the investment chapter, it is all the countries have committed to a negative list approach. It really looks like the services negative list approach, and not to complicate things, but there are some countries, Singapore included, where you'll actually see a combined services and investment list, which is a good thing, because then you don't actually have to be referring to multiple different annexes and lists. But of course, that combined services and investment list, that's only undertaken by just a few of our partners, Singapore being one of them. So again, very similar when you have a look at it. It spells out the sector, subsector, industry classification, and then more importantly, what is the measure that the party is actually reserving against, and then the description, etc. It is, again, has both a list A and a list B. A list B is one where you will notice from the example that Eric gave, it is a little bit more general and a bit more broad. You often see countries saying that they reserve to actually amend or adopt any measure for those subsectors. It tends to be subsectors which are, I would say, very important for the country itself. Again, for example, for Singapore, it'll be things like land or infrastructure relating to public utilities, etc. Another mechanism I just want to run through, which is part of our market access, which in my opinion is also another important gain for RCEP countries, which is this idea of ratchet mechanism. So what it really does is that, with the exception of our CLM friends, is that when parties to the RCEP decide to liberalize certain subsectors, once they make those amendments in the future, they actually can't backtrack from that commitment. So we actually are able to lock in that liberalization for those investment subsectors. This can actually be very significant and have a very lasting impact in terms of reducing the barriers for investors that might find that, you know, as countries go through their usual political cycles, etc., that they may flip-flop on certain commitments. But this ratchet mechanism actually is a legally binding tool for us to commit those countries and ourselves, of course, to furthering investment liberalization, which of course our view is that benefits all investors for all countries. So RCEP, in fact, marks the first ASEAN Plus FTA where our ASEAN external partners or ASEAN Plus One partners have tabled their commitments to liberalize specific sectors. There are about 6, as you see on the screen: manufacturing, agri, fishery, forestry, mining and quarrying, as well as energy. I want to just go through, I won't go through all of it, and I think these might be apparent as you get your hands on the market, the list that we mentioned. So there are obviously certain gains that can be had from the commitments that are made by even our own ASEAN partners, and I wanted to just highlight those in beige or in orange. So for those of you that may not be aware, for Indonesia, at least under RCEP, they've expanded the coverage to include portfolio investments. They've also opened up the agriculture sector. For a place like Laos, they have relaxed on their commitments in terms of the domestic requirement for joint ventures. Similarly, for Myanmar, they have also opened up certain sectors that were previously closed. And of course, the same for the other ASEAN countries as well. So I'm just cognizant of time. I'll just try to wrap up. Okay, so the next couple of provisions relating to what we call in case something happens provisions. So really, I think, you know, as investors, we hope for the best, but sometimes really bad things happen in certain countries, such as armed conflict happens or civil strife, and your property gets damaged by whichever party, right? State or non-state. And so this article on compensation for losses is really one of the few investment protection clauses or articles that we have within the investment chapter. Essentially, it states that the country which you have your investment in commits to compensating you as the foreign investor as it would in the same way as its own domestic investors. Next is on expropriation. Expropriation here refers to an action by the state or an authority delegated by the state in which they take away the property or the investment from its owner. Of course, member countries in RCEP, they commit first and foremost not to do that unless for very specific reasons, and there are 3 very specific reasons for them to actually take such an action, and that is for public purpose. It is done in a non-discriminatory manner and is in accordance with a due process of the law. Another important thing to note is that in any of these cases, compensation must be paid to you as the foreign investor, equivalent to fair market value, so that you are so-called no worse off. So this article on promotion and facilitation of investment is not legally binding, and you can tell from the word endeavor. So that's a tip. Every time you read an FTA, no matter which chapter, if you see the word endeavor, etc., it tends to be not legally binding. But what's important is that this article speaks to the spirit of the investment chapter, which is really about promoting and facilitating investment among the RCEP countries. So these include the authorities committing to doing things like joint investment promotion activities, them also committing to streamlining procedures to, for example, admit investment into their countries where all of these are possible. So I'm on my last slide. There is one thing that for those of you that might be familiar with the investment chapter may find missing, and that is that there is no articles speaking about the investor-state dispute settlement provisions, or ISDS. Unlike in some of our other ASEAN and ASEAN Plus investment chapters, the discussion around that will actually reconvene no later than 2 years from when RCEP is entered into force. And let's just say that it will be akan datang. So that's something to take note of as well. And with that, that's actually the end of my presentation, and I'll stick around for any questions that you might have later. Over, back to you.
Thank you, Faridah. So next we have Mr. Lam from Wong Partnership, who will talk us through the IP chapter and the e-commerce chapter of the ASEAN agreement. Mr. Lam, please.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. Thanks also to SBF and the organizers for having me. And of course, thanks to all panelists and for your presentations, which have been, of course, very useful in setting out the framework. And you will see that many of the principles that have been discussed so far, in fact, carry through into the two chapters I'll be talking about, which would be IP and e-commerce. I think a prevalent theme that you would have already seen is that there's a lot of discussion around market access and so forth. So this is then carried through in rather more practical ways in these two chapters, as we will now be discussing. Of course, at the end of the session, happy to take questions. So first, I'll cover the IP chapter. It's probably useful to talk about what exactly constitutes IP rights, because I think often there's a lot of confusion. So of course, IP is essentially an intangible asset, and that asset or that right of protection of the property derives from various exclusive rights that you will obtain as an IP owner. And there are different types of IP, right? There's no one kind of broad IP right as such. So when we actually talk about IP, we usually would have to be rather more specific. There are various categories of it. So there's trademarks that protect a business's branding and the distinctiveness of a product source. All right. So of course, when you see a brand today, you know straight away who the manufacturer of that product is, and that becomes immediately a differentiator of the product. So of course, branding is the kind of the trademark rights are so critical in a lot of the initiatives of local companies, say whenever they're looking at opportunities in relation to their brand and so forth. So trademarks are very useful in allowing for companies, especially many Singaporean companies, to expand into the region. Patents, these cover inventions. Basically, protection will be over a patented process or a patented product, and a new, so of course, again, this one primarily relates to a lot of the more technological innovations, often the product R&D outcomes and so forth. Registered designs cover the external appearance or design of an article. And interestingly, the new trend these days has been also to extend it to things like virtual products. So you might be wondering what virtual products would be. Our Singapore Act, for example, has now been amended to cover things like, virtual keyboards and so forth, and things like that. Copyright, this protects expressions of ideas in a material form, and the typical sorts of subject matter that this will cover would be things like novel, film, scripts, music, but also things like computer software. So this is a very, very core area of IP protection, certainly a very large area of protection. And then there's also confidential information. This will cover things like trade secrets and methods of manufacture and so forth. So you're putting it into context. I guess, you can look at this picture or illustration of one of our homegrown brands, Creative. So they've got their outlier earbuds here. And you can see that, even in a single product, you could have multiple layers of IP. So that you would have the trademark in the Creative branding. There would be copyright covering the manual, but also the software that would be embedded within the earphones. Registered design covering the external appearance of, say, the charging unit and also the earbuds themselves. Patents can cover various aspects of the technological innovations that have gone into the functioning and of the earbuds. And you could also have confidential information or trade secret protection over aspects of some of the manufacturing know-how and so forth. So you can see that for each one of these rights that Creative would own the IP over, they would have the exclusivity to use the patented invention or the design or the trademark and so forth. And of course, if you've been following what has happened, they've been successful in obtaining substantial damages against some of the other technology giants such as Apple and so forth as a result of infringement of their IP rights. So it's very useful to bear in mind that actually IP rights are a very important business asset. And why that is so, you can look at it as protecting against infringement. So it's protecting your turf in a way. So my example just now as to how Creative has managed to fend off other competitors in its space. But you can also look at it as an opportunity for revenue generation. So I gave the example earlier of franchising and licensing opportunities. And this will give you the IP right owner a potential for generating revenue through things like income from royalties and also collaboration opportunities. The fact that you have an IP arsenal, for example, could allow you, particularly in the area of patents and copyrights, this could give you opportunities for cross-licensing of your right. So very often, in fact, especially in the technology space, you will find that parties will enter into cross-licensing arrangements because they recognize the value of each other's IP rights, and then they horse trade, all right? So they give access to their patents in exchange for access to their, say, competitor patents, which are very critical in the way in which they will be going to market. So this, slide here can highlight some of the key benefits of having IP protection. Also want to just highlight that we do have an overarching kind of IP strategy. This was released in April, and I wanted to draw it out because it's so timely. You will see that a lot of this vision and where the general trust for IP protection in Singapore is headed is really about positioning Singapore as a global hub. All right, so it is a hub not only in terms of recognizing IP as an asset, but also using Singapore as a hub for dispute resolution and so forth. All right, so if you do have the time, please do consider taking a look at the IP strategy. As I said, it's a very new document, but this is going to outline Singapore's approach to enhancing IP protection in the very near future. So on IP recognition as such, taking a kind of a bigger picture snapshot of what the trends are like, you will see from this chart that overall, amongst even all the ASEAN economies, there is certainly an increasing recognition of the value of IP. So in this chart, you will see that overall the trends are all pointing upward. Businesses in the region are also starting to recognize the value of IP. So you will see here that there's all been a lot of greater emphasis placed on securing IP registrations. In this case, this chart shows you trademark applications. And then also on the front of patent applications, the overall trend across ASEAN has been that there has been a significant increase, also an uptick in terms of how companies are looking at protecting their patents. So how does RCEP help us in this regard? If you look at the big picture, there are probably 4 main themes that the RCEP IP chapter will help to bolster. Ms. Sulaimah has really talked about some of them. Eric has also talked about some of them. And of course, Faridah also about the market access aspects of things. So you will see that when translated to the IP chapter, it is about improved information and access to IP and transparency. So things like databases, things like the application processes, having more clarity about some of the what's going on your application, encouraging economic integration between member states to promote trade and investment, facilitating protection IP across member states, and then harmonizing the procedural and substantive protections that your IP actually confers on you. All right, so deep diving on the last point that I mentioned, which is about harmonization. One of the requirements of the RCEP is to have a common set of international multilateral IP agreements that all the member states would be signing up to. So you will see here, there would be a commitment of all member states to sign up to things like the Patent Cooperation Treaty. This one facilitates a harmonized application process for patents. The Berne Convention, which relates primarily to IP protection in the area of copyright. The Madrid Protocol, which relates to the trademark registration processes. The WIPO Copyright Treaty, WIPO Performances and Phonograms Treaty. Phonograms is this fancy term for basically sound recordings. So, you know, the music recordings that you would hear, typically that's what we call phonograms. And the Marrakesh Treaty on access to published works for persons with certain disabilities. All right, so in the slide, I've kind of just, you know, referenced some of the countries that have not already acceded to these existing multilateral IP agreements. So one of the immediate benefits of RCEP is that across all member states, you will, through this, know that you will have a standardized set of protections that you can expect, standardized baseline set of protections that you can expect across all of the RCEP states. Specifically on trademark protection, there has been an enhancement or standardization of the definition of trademark infringement. And so you'll be happy to know that, you know, a Singapore style definition, which of course follows through from the UK Commonwealth kind of definition, and you would have seen it also in other states such as Malaysia. There is now a standardized set of definition of infringement. But importantly, there's also the recognition of bad faith protection. So one of the very common issues that many businesses face in the region is about bad faith mark registrations. What these are typically are the squatters. You have a lot of traders in the region that might be just looking out for new product launches, new brand launches, and then they go ahead and secure a protection in their home countries. And then when the actual proprietor of the mark tries to go into the market, you find yourself blocked. All right, so with the RCEP, there is now a specific commitment to put in place bad faith protection to guard against this kind of activity. There's also well-known mark protection, sound mark protection, collective marks and certification marks. These are quite useful tools in signaling that a product kind of meets a particular standard. So one type of certification mark today that you might be familiar with, those in the food industry, you know, you have Health Promotion Board has got a healthier food kind of logo, right? So immediately customers can recognize that the product meets a certain kind of standard or quality. You know, certification marks allow for that kind of thing. So now with the RCEP, there will be protection and recognition of these kinds of marks across the board. There's also increased enforcement standards and the extension of enforcement rights to the digital environment for trademark infringement. So of course, as we'll also be seeing in the next chapter, complementing e-commerce expansion, there is going to be enhanced protection of trademarks in the digital space as well, and improve transparency, information access. So registration process enhancements, the availability of electronic databases for checking what are existing applications and registrations. Part and parcel of these enhancements will also include things like an opportunity to oppose registrations that you might have prior rights to, and so forth. So this represents a lot of the initiatives on the trademarks chapter, the trademarks section of the IP chapter. As for patents and industrial design, there's also been harmonization of patentable subject matter. What is recognizable as a patent? And this will extend to include both product patents as well as process patents. Process patents are basically patents that cover a method of manufacturing a particular product. Examination process enhancements, so that there is standardization, opportunities for us to understand what is the basis of objections, expedited examination options. Singapore has a lot of fast-track procedures that can be invoked for patent examination, for example. And so RCEP also contains broad commitments to parties, member states exploring such expedited examination options. Publication of patent applications at 18 months. So this is about also transparency. So if you file an application today, existingly, for example, in Singapore, you can expect that your patent application will be published in 18 months. And of course, this is probably more beneficial to the parties who are your competitors, because then these members of the public can then be able to understand what exactly has been filed and what exactly is the scope of the claim, all right, that is being made in relation to the patent. The backdrop to this is that patent applications take a really long time. Usually, the applicant has about 30 to 36 months, even if they invoke the PCT process to decide on the range of protections and so forth. Because of that, publication is often a very important aspect of that transparency. Novelty testing is also being extended to prior art that's available on the internet. So when you file a patent, you need to show that it meets the requirement of novelty, meaning that it is new, it is not something that has been anticipated by the prior art or the state of the art. And so that's one aspect of the requirements for patentability. And RCEP allows for recognition of publications on the internet to be relevant for the purposes of assessing novelty. All right, so not something new for Singaporeans, because our test of novelty has always been what we call universal novelty. So it's very, any source can be potentially invalidating. But I think RCEP's useful in harmonizing that kind of a viewpoint or approach to assessing novelty. On industrial designs, likewise, there's been harmonization of protection. On textiles, whilst textile designs are often recognized as an aspect of registered designs, there is an RCEP commitment to not lead to allow for that kind of protection to essentially become a non-trade barrier, right? So on the copyright front, there's been specific extension to communication to the public by wired or wireless means. So this right here about communication is very critical to internet-based communications, right? So whilst of course in Singapore it's not a new right, but I think in the region, a statement like this is helpful for harmonization of protection of work on the internet. Phonogram right, I talked about phonograms just now, so basically these are sound recordings. Public performers, performances right in performances, broadcasting satellites, CMOs are collective management organizations. So these are royalty collection organizations. So, and also on government software use, these are all aspects that the RCEP will now cover. On government software use, this one is interesting. It commits governments to using non-infringing software in the course of, enhanced protection and remedies. We have existingly protections against circumvention of technological protection measures. So anti-copying technologies and stuff like that. So the RCEP also enhances and harmonizes protection on this front. And RMIs deal with something similar. RMIs are rights management information. So this is the kind of metadata that might be embedded in works that might control the number of times the work may be accessed and so forth. Very important increasingly in streaming type environments. And also, as you might be familiar, you can rent movies on the internet, for example, and how that might be controlled as to the number of times you may watch it, the duration over which you may watch it. All that is defined by RMI, and protection of the RMI is therefore also an aspect of harmonization of the RCEP. There's also increased enforcement standards, and again, extension of digital enforcement rights to the digital environment. So yet another aspect where there has been emphasis on this increasing embrace of digitalization and the internet. Geographical indications, these are the sorts of right or exclusive IP rights associated with particular locale. So things like Parma ham, Champagne, for example, RCEP recognizes for the adoption and maintenance of transparency and due process for protection of geographical indications. There's also a recognition for protection of TK, traditional knowledge, genetic resources, and folklore. Border measures, this is to enhance and affirm the processes and administrative procedures against importation of pirated goods. Okay, so a major strategy for a lot of IP rights owners is to stop goods that are counterfeits at the borders, right? Prevent their importation into domestic markets. So RCEP also enhances border measure controls. And some of the other areas include having member states recognize a concept of unfair competition. In Singapore, we protect rights in unregistered marks as well through an action in passing off. And this translates into typically then this concept of unfair competition in other jurisdictions. Domain name protection, the adoption of a uniform dispute resolution process style kind of recourse for CCTLDs, so country code top level domains. So you could have, for example, in Singapore, we use the .sg country code CCTLD. We have a dispute resolution process called the SDRP, Singapore Dispute Resolution Process, that allows for very quick disposal of bad faith applications. All right, so the RCEP kind of establishes that member states should commit to similar recourse processes for bad faith applications in their own country code domain namespace. Undisclosed information protection. So this extends to confidential information, trade secrets, and so forth. Enforcement, enhancements, harmonization of remedies, things like the availability of damages, counting of profits, and so forth. Digital environment enhancement, and also transparency in the process. So these kind of all are the nutshell, high-level summary of what the RCEP chapter on IP will cover. So what are the benefits to your business? I think quite clearly increased convenience, lower cost in obtaining your protection. So obviously, seeking the protection is a very important aspect of IP, especially where IP right is registrable. If you don't seek that registration, you don't put in an application for registration, your rights are not protected. All right, so the enhancements on the process will facilitate that. Of course, once you have then secured your IP rights where they are registrable or you've otherwise met your legal requirements for protection, then as you would have seen, the RCEP also has got recognition of the substantive rights and a harmonization or uniform approach towards what those rights might substantively mean. And then, of course, when it comes down to protection, you will have also seen from the RCEP chapter that it establishes certain baseline protections, the expectations of the kind of recourse that you're going to be able to get, kinds of remedies that you're going to be able to get for the infringement of your IP right. So just to underscore this importance of some of the concepts around bad faith and so forth, like I mentioned, many Singaporean businesses do find that they are often prevented from entering a market because they find that somebody else has beaten them to registering their trademarks. So just as there is now recognition of bad faith actions to get rid of or challenge some of these applications, I think, if you are exploring a strategy to expand into the region, do very carefully think about whether you want to preemptively file your trademarks, domain names, and so forth, all right? Plan ahead, file your applications early, and then tap on these streamlined application and filing systems to improve your position and protect your IP rights. Now, moving on to the e-commerce chapter, I think everybody is very familiar in this post-COVID world that e-commerce is so critical. And there's some very staggering numbers as to the importance of e-commerce moving forward. So RCEP also facilitate many of the kinds of issues that businesses will be facing in the e-commerce space. So big picture, it will promote the use and development of e-commerce and facilitate digital trade, create an environment of trust and confidence in the use of e-commerce, assist small and medium size enterprises overcoming some obstacles in the use of e-commerce, and then also enhancing accountability and consumer confidence in e-commerce initiatives. So drilling down, we've heard quite a bit about the measures to facilitate trade documentation and so forth. So this chapter takes these things further in dealing with specific commitments to enhance paperless trading. So the acceptance of electronic trade administration documents, for example, is a specific commitment under RCEP. Recognizing the validity of e-signatures and electronic authentication technologies. So under RCEP, the member states are going to have to recognize e-signatures, and of course in Singapore, I think many people would have become a lot more familiar with things like your DocuSign signatures and so forth over the last year. So under RCEP, there's going to have to be more uniform recognition of these kinds of e-signatures across the board. Protection of consumers. As many of you might be aware, we have made major strides in terms of consumer protection over the last few years. So we have got legislative instruments such as the Consumer Protection, Fair Trading Act, and so forth. You will see on this e-commerce front under us in RCEP that there is also a similar push toward having member states protect consumers from fraud and misleading conduct, protecting consumers' personal information, and also adopting measures against unsolicited commercial messages, spam, all right, and having a recourse against non-compliance. There are also requirements that no customs duties must be imposed on electronic transmissions per se, all right, between member states. In terms of also encouraging cross-border e-commerce, there's no requirement for local computing facilities as a condition of conduct of business. So in other words, I think this means that you're not going to be forced to have local hosting of your websites and so forth in order to address a particular territory. And there will also be commitments on enabling cross-border transfers of information by electronic means for the conduct of business. There's also commitment to recognizing the importance of enhancing cybersecurity capabilities. So RCEP deals with that as well. So what are the key benefits? As you can see on the e-commerce chapter, it's about lowering barriers to entry, increased convenience in not having, say, local hosting requirements, and also on the promotion of the use of trade documentation becoming electronic. It's also about boosting consumer confidence, right? Establishing baseline protection against unfair business practices, which is intended to, well, both level the playing field and also allow for greater consumer confidence and correspondingly adoption of e-commerce platforms, lowering costs in terms of the adoption of e-commerce, so you don't have to be duplicating unnecessary infrastructure. And to kind of sum it all up, if you look at the two chapters, the IP and the e-commerce chapters, the sorts of call to action that businesses in Singapore ought to be thinking about will probably be these. Seek to identify what your IP assets are, and then once you have done that identification, proactively go out there and secure that protection. Make use of the harmonized processes to make your IP applications, to register the IP, or to make sure that you meet the legal requirements for local protection. And then once you have those baseline foundations in place, that gives you the opportunity to explore overseas expansion, right? So you would be in a much better position to offer franchises. You'd be in a good place to also look at how local partners can better distribute your products. You can look at potential manufacturing opportunities or cross-licensing opportunities. You expand your market footprint in turn through the use of e-commerce, and also see how you can be embracing some of these paperless trade and logistics initiatives that we've also spoken about. So that's it from me. Happy to take questions during the Q&A session. Back to the moderator.
Yes, thanks, Chung Niang. I think we just have a couple of minutes for maybe one or maximum two questions. In the meantime, maybe Nicole, we can launch the feedback to go. Yeah, and the rest of the questions, if we don't manage to cover them, please don't worry. We will get in touch with speakers by email, get answers, and then share them with everyone. Yes, Sue, sorry, can you hear me?
Okay.
Yeah. Just wondering
sorry.
whether you have any kind of quick advice for our businesses who are looking forward to RCEP. There are overlaps within the RCEP parties, not just with ASEAN and ASEAN Plus One FTAs, but also CPTPP. So I think that's some questions that our businesses have on their mind, how they should look into these two mega regional agreements, both with huge potential to accumulate among the parties. And also, while we are waiting for RCEP to enter into force, any advice for them to kind of prepare themselves for when they finally make use of RCEP?
Okay, thanks. All right, I'll answer this one question. I'll answer the easy one first. Whether a particular RCEP country can actually, who have not ratified, enjoy the benefits of the agreement. The short answer there is no. Okay, all the signatories will need to ratify the agreement. That means before they can enjoy the benefits. So, for example, that's why we give the the minimum, at least the 6 ASEAN member states and the 3 AFPs will have to ratify, and then you can implement. In the event that all 15 countries to ratify the agreement by, say, October this year, then all the 15 will be able to implement and enjoy the benefits together. Okay. If you, for example, there are only 9 who have ratified this year, and then, you know, the remainder says, okay, I can only do it next year, middle of next year of first quarter, they will have to wait until they ratify, then they can actually enjoy the benefits. I hope that's clear, Leon. Thank you for that question. Then the other question that I think we have time is on the comparison between the CPTPP and the RCEP. Whether one is, you know, I would say firstly that both the CPTPP and the RCEP, they're both valuable agreements, right? They've got their own, what do you call that, areas of benefits, you know, to its membership. And the objective is clear for both, is to advance regional integration. But because they comprise different membership and, you know, especially for RCEP, I mentioned earlier, different level of development, we expected from day one that there will be this gap between the CPTP and the RCEP. When we embarked on RCEP, we were very, very realistic and pragmatic that, you know, we know that given the membership, we can never, and, you know, match the CPTPP level of ambition and, you know, commitments. But that said, I know, you know, for a fact that there are some areas, for example, in the customs procedures and also in IP, where, you know, when we compare, it's either the same, at the same level for RCEP and CPTPP. And, you know, even for IP, there are a few areas which actually it's slightly better, you know, adopted better than in CPTPP. So there are areas for that. But, you know, whether we've done a detailed comparison, the answer is no. We've not done a detailed comparison between the two FTAs because that was not our objective in the first instance. But, you know, I guess we could do that, you know, going forward. So you know, here again, I think it would be up to companies to look into both and assess what is the best agreement for them to use going forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sue.
Okay.
I think there are a lot of questions from the audience, but unfortunately we don't have the time and we don't want to hold everyone up. So we will follow up with all the speakers on the various questions you have, and then kind of circulate the answers by the speakers by email. So don't worry if you haven't got your question answered yet. If any kind of questions come up to you in the next couple of days as well, please feel free to write into us and we'll include that as well. So once again, thank you, you know, big thank you to our speakers for the time and effort and your insights to today's webinar, and thank you all to the participants as well for staying with us throughout on this very detailed and comprehensive webinar.
Thank you.
Thank you, and I hope to see everyone
again
tomorrow.
Questions.
Yes.